All right, the last part of the executive branch that we need to cover is about the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is a large grouping, and I mean large grouping, of government agencies, bureaus, departments, and corporations that do two major things, and this should become second nature to you. They implement and regulate policy. We talked earlier that the president is the head of the executive branch, and it's his job to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And over time, the size of the executive branch has exploded with all these people that are going to effectively help the president implement and regulate the laws that are created by Congress. And so a couple different classifications. We've got cabinet departments. These are the ones you're probably most familiar with. The State Department, the Treasury Department, each of which has a secretary as its head. And then we have regulatory and independent agencies. And you know these too, you just don't realize it. These would be government agencies like the FBI or the IRS or NASA that are going to be kind of experts in the field at implementing and regulating certain types of policy. And then we have one other grouping called the government corporation, which are actually government businesses that make money but are ran by the government, like the U.S. Postal Service, for example. Some staggering numbers here. We've got millions of government workers in the United States. 20 million or so of those are at the state and local levels. And the reason there are so many is because every time the federal government comes down with new rules and new regulations, a lot of the time the burden falls on the states and local governments to carry out those policies. And so the number of workers at those levels keeps going up and up and up and up. But we also have 2.5 million federal employees from all different walks of life. And then on top of that, another 1.5 million military troops, which kind of are part of the bureaucracy, but not really. And then we have a huge handful of those people who work in foreign countries as well. A couple of statistics here. The Department of Defense makes up about 25% of the bureaucracy. Just tons of people working, with military affairs and things like that to keep the country safe. The post office, for obvious reasons, is going to be a ton of those workers. About a third of the bureaucracy is there. Veterans Affairs, another 10%, and all the rest is scattered throughout all the other different departments and agencies. All right, so let's talk about the different levels of the bureaucracy. We have low-level bureaucracy and we have high-level bureaucracy all the way to the top. So the lowest level would be called the civil service. When I say lowest, doesn't mean they're unimportant. It just means as far as political stature and prominence, they'd be at the bottom. These would be non-political jobs. And we can trace the beginnings of the civil service all the way back to the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. In those days, you may recall this idea of patronage or the spoil system, which was a lot of these jobs would be rewards for people who fulfilled some kind of political role playing. And so this is how votes were attained by the political machines. And so from Andrew Jackson all the way up to Chester Alan Arthur, kind of the game that the party bosses would play with neighborhoods would be, if you vote Democrat or if you vote Republican, depending on which machine you're talking about, then we'll hook you up with some kind of civil service job. You can work in the post office, you can work on the loading docks, you can work at the customs house or something like that. And then, of course, back in the days of Chester Alan Arthur, he surprised everybody by making it illegal to award spoils or political jobs to people for their patronage. And so today, fast forward, and we have lower level and mid-range jobs in the government are awarded now in the merit principle, which is rooted in the old Chinese bureaucracy system of ancient and medieval times. So now you take a civil service test if you want to be a federal employee. It can't be awarded to you just for political purposes or cronyism or something like that. You got to take a test, and the results will suggest that A, you're competent to hold a certain kind of job, and B, what kind of job would you be best at? And so all this is handled by the Office of Personnel Management, and they administer the test, run the human resources of the civil service and award jobs like that. The Hatch Act of 1993 should be mentioned as well because we're trying to take the politics out of the civil service. These are people who are doing non-political jobs, jobs that need to be done, like the post office. But they did feel the need to make that an even stronger division between politics and labor by making it illegal for any of these civil servants to engage in political activities while on duty. So if you are a mail carrier, you can't have a vote Obama or vote Bush sticker on the bumper of your mail truck. Just so we have a very clear division. It's even a higher threshold for people in the higher level of the bureaucracy who actually do have somewhat political functions, who maybe you are involved in national security making or something like that. And you may never engage in politics if you're one of these personnel. The next level up is the senior executive service. We have a pay scale for federal employees called the GS scale. And so if you're talking about the SES, you're talking about higher level jobs, way up on the 16 through 18 part of the scale. So these would be professionals. These would be experts. These are PhDs, engineers, scientists, economists, people who still are not necessarily politicians, but they may be involved in political policy making, but they're experts in their field. So we might call them the cream of the crop. And you have immense job security by being a member of the SCS. After a probation period, you basically cannot be terminated, or any civil servant for that matter, especially when you have expertise that people who rely on you don't have. On the other hand, like with any government union job, it's really impossible to fire incompetent workers. If you get by that probationary period, you're there for life, and you can't be fired for doing a bad job because you're protected from that. And the rationale is, if nobody has to worry about their job, that if they don't have to worry about politics or about being fired, then they can focus on their job. And that's kind of an antiquated notion. Nowadays, anybody who's being realistic with themselves knows that there are plenty of people who are just sitting around collecting paychecks, knowing that they have the ultimate job security by working for the government. At the very top of the bureaucracy are the political elites. These are the people that you've heard of. These are the politicians who run the cabinet departments. They are the heads of the departments. Of the agencies and regulatory agencies, independent agencies. These are big-time people. And that's kind of one thing that a lot of people stop and think about. Do we really want the FBI or NASA ran by politicians? Because they're almost always going to be political appointees. And I think you could go both ways on it. You could suggest that this is a political game, so you better have a politically savvy person in charge of things. On the other hand, you could say, these are highly technical policy areas where we should have a person who knows what they're talking about being in charge. You could be persuaded either way. The way it works, though, is if you want to get one of these jobs, it's not like opening up the classifieds and applying for a job with your resume. If you want to be a political elite, you better be in good with the president, or at the very least be in good with his party, or be a pretty big-time financial contributor to a campaign or to the party. Every now and then, Congress is going to publish the Plum Book, which is a list of all the elite government jobs that are available, heads of agencies. This would include cream of the crop jobs and all that sort of thing too. There's about 500 high-level positions at the elite level of bureaucracy, and then below that, another 2,500 that are still very nice jobs to have. But you're not going to walk in and just get them. You better know people and have a name somewhere in Washington. So with the political elite jobs, the president is going to make all of these appointments, and they're all subject to Senate approval. Some appointments, especially those that have to do with foreign personnel like ambassadors, go to top campaign donors. And so if you help the president get elected by writing some really big checks, one of your rewards might be to be a United States ambassador to some cozy Caribbean island where you're not really going to have to do anything other than just soak it up. And every now and then, if an American tourist gets stranded, then you help them out, and that's about it. And we're talking about ambassadors to major nations, like ambassador to China or ambassador to Russia. It's not going to be a donor, most likely. It's going to be somebody who's a little more politically savvy. All right, let's zoom in on these organizations of the bureaucracy a little bit. So obviously the most visible is the cabinet departments. So we have 15 cabinet departments today, and each of them is headed by a secretary, except for one that always makes it a little difficult. The Justice Department is not headed by a Secretary of Justice. That department is headed by the Attorney General, who is essentially the top law enforcement official in the country. So we've got secretaries of these departments, we've got undersecretaries, we got assistants, anybody who's got any kind of importance politically in these cabinet departments is going to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Each of these departments has their own staff, their own budget, and it is a well-oiled political machine. Now here's the thing. Underneath all of these 15 cabinet departments are a whole nother series of smaller units like bureaus and services and offices and administration. You have to visualize the bureaucracy like a flowchart or like a big tree. You got the president at the top of the tree, and you've got 15 major branches called the cabinet departments, and just about everything else is going to be under the supervision of each of these 15 departments. There are some that are not, that we'll get to in a moment. It's just a labyrinth of all these people and all these offices that are doing the work of the federal government, working to implement and regulate policy. The largest department of the 15 is Defense, followed by Health and Human Services, mainly because the Social Security Administration became an independent agency, but they've become separated from them since then. But there's still a lot of people who have to do all the paperwork for various things regarding entitlements and things like that. Regulatory agencies are these government offices that are going to fall under one of these 15 cabinet departments, and they're going to supervise a specific field in which the personnel, the cream of the crop folks, are going to be experts. They're going to make and enforce rules over their sphere of influence. So let's say we get a law that goes through from Congress that has to do with drugs, then the implementation of that law is going to ultimately fall to the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration. Or let's say we have a terrorist attack, or actually more likely some new laws passed about how airplanes and airports are run. That law is going to be implemented and regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. Okay, and you've got endless examples of what you can come up with for these different agencies. The way they're governed is that they have member boards. So there's 5 to 10 members on these boards, all of which are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And they also establish their terms. They're going to have staggered terms from the president because, again, you don't want the heads of these agencies to have their terms coinciding with the president for political reasons. You want them to be separated as much as possible. And so their terms would be staggered. No agent in any regulatory agency has been fired since 1935. So again, there's an example of the job security you have as either a political elite or someone who's a cream of the crop of one of these regulatory agencies. Slightly different from regulatory agencies are the independent executive agencies. And so, again, for political reasons, we want these agencies to be a little more insulated from the executive branch. So they operate the same way, but they do not have to answer to any one of the 15 cabinet departments and therefore have a little bit of separation from the president himself. So, for example, the CIA. The CIA is the intelligence gathering operation in the federal government. Why would we want the CIA to not have to answer to, say, the Justice Department and also the president? Well, maybe you want the CIA to have the flexibility to watch those people as well. With other entities like the EPA, it's because of their expertise, and it's because you want to give them a free rein on making their own rules. So, for example, a lot of times what Congress will do is intentionally write vague laws and basically empower an independent agency like the EPA to write their own rules. So if the law says the EPA shall have the power to write specific laws about such and such issues, well, then you get the EPA writing just thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of regulation. And remember, these are unelected people, almost all of which whose names you don't know. And so now we've got an issue with democracy. These are people who are unaccountable to the voters, to democracy. They make their own rules. And remember, who's supposed to make rules? Congress is supposed to make the rules. And yet they are separated and they have the ability to make what effectively looks like rules or laws. She's making their rules. But you got a whole other set of examples here. FCC or the Federal Election Commission, for obvious reasons, we don't want them to be subject to any political pressure because we want them to maintain fair elections. The Fed is another good example of why we want independent agencies to be free from political pressure from the president or a cabinet secretary. You want the Fed to have free rein over setting interest rates and making regulations for the economy, because if they didn't have that freedom, then you would have the president having a whole lot more power to tinker with the economy than we might like. And so these are experts. This is the job they're devoted to. They can give it more attention. And so most people would agree that it's good that they are insulated from the executive branch to a degree. Federal Trade Commission, SEC, NASA are all other examples of independent executive agencies. Last classification we have are government corporations. And these are businesses. They make a profit, or at least attempt to. So actually, they rarely make a profit, but they do charge money for their services. But usually they have lower prices. For example, to do business with the post office is usually cheaper than doing it with FedEx. However, FedEx is going to give you better service because they're private entities and they almost always do a better job. This is work that could be done by the private sector, and which begs the question, why is the government doing it then? Well, with some of these things like the post office, they have their origins way back in the early days before we did have private couriers. So could FedEx or UPS take over delivering the mail? Yeah, they probably could, and it would seem to be more expensive. They would charge more, but remember, you wouldn't have to pay taxes to support them, and they would definitely do a better job than the post office would. But the post office is kind of an American icon, and it goes way back, and the government has always done mail, and so they're going to continue doing mail for the foreseeable future. Sometimes the government takes over a sick industry, something that is vital, like Amtrak was, or train transportation, and they'll go in there and take it over and do an okay job running it. I mean, Amtrak, it's fun to get on Amtrak and take a little ride, but tickets are higher than they should be, and honestly, a private business could probably do a better job. And sometimes the government takes over, at least temporarily, businesses that are in some kind of dire straits, like General Motors several years ago was really in bad shape when the economy went bad, and so the government stepped in, took over some of their affairs, took over some of their financial obligations, and got them back on their feet again. So you have some examples here: Post Office, PBS, Amtrak. FDIC is an organization ran by the government that is going to insure bank accounts. And so you got lots of examples. And then another quasi-government operation is called the GSE, or the government-sponsored enterprise. And these are banks that were originally created by the government, but then since then allowed to operate privately, free from government, or at least seemingly free from government control. And what they do is generate a flow of credit where people can get loans for various things. So, for example, you got Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are government-sponsored enterprises that loan money for people to buy homes. Sallie Mae is a big lending arm that is going to allow people to get student loans. And usually they don't work directly with the people. They'll work with the banks, who will in turn lend the money to the people themselves. So they're technically not government corporations, but they kind of are in the same realm, and so we'll mention them here. All right, here's the most important two things about the bureaucracy. What do they do? Bureaucracy's main job is to implement the policy and the policy decisions from the other branches and make them happen. Remember, Congress makes laws, the president signs those laws into action, and then it's the job of the bureaucracy to make sure that they're being implemented the way they're intended to, or if we're being honest with ourselves, the way the politicians in the executive branch want them to happen, and then to make sure that they're being regulated to function properly. So, policy implementation is a key term that we should use for what does the bureaucracy do. They take the policies of the other policymakers and then put them into action. So, reasons for failure. Why might they not be very good at this? Well, number one, a lack of clarity. Rarely does Congress write a law that's passed by or signed by the president that is going to have all the little details completed and filled in. There's always going to be gaps and gray areas in the law. And so if the bureaucracy doesn't do something that was maybe intended, or they misinterpret something because of these vagaries, then you could have a breakdown in policy implementation. They may have the lack of resources. Things are so complicated with policy making these days that Congress may pass a law that's signed by the president, and the bureaucracy in no way has the ability to implement it because they just don't have the time or money or resources to do it. Administrative routine is another reason why they would fail in accomplishing policy implementation. Here's the thing about these public sector employee unions that make up the bureaucracy. They have a contract, and they're going to follow their administrative routines, that we would call standard operating procedure. And so if for some reason a law or policy demanded that they do something that was not in their contract, they're just going to throw up their arms and say, I don't got to do that. It's not in the contract. It's not in the SOPs, and so I am not doing it. And that may be something that is vital to making sure that the law is implemented as it should be. On the flip side of that, you got administrators' discretion. Well, at the same time, bureaucrats are not going to do what they don't have to do based on standard operating procedure. The ones that are savvy are going to say, especially the higher ups, are going to say, well, I have discretion on this matter, and so I'm going to do what I think needs to be done. Even if it doesn't clearly say that I should do this, I'm going to use my best discretion. And so we see this at the local level with street-level bureaucrats like police officers. The rule book for police officers does not have every single possible little minute detail of what might happen on the job for an entire career. They have to think on their toes. They have to think on their feet. Most of the time, they're using common sense and they get the job done. Sometimes they make a discretionary mistake. And at the federal level, when you're talking about big bureaucracies and millions of workers, if a handful of people kind of use their own discretion, maybe not in the best way, you could wind up with some things getting screwed up. The second thing that they do after they implement the law is to regulate the law and continuously make sure that it continues to be happening the way it's supposed to. So when we talk about policy regulation, we're talking about the ability of the government to implement the law and regulate the private sector to make sure it's happening. So if we get a law from Congress that's signed by the president about banking rules, it's going to be the job of, say, the Securities and Exchange Commission to go into Wall Street, into all the investment firms, and all the people who deal with banking to make sure that that law is being enforced, and they're going to impose their regulations and their checkpoints and all these things to make sure it's happening. So this is where you see kind of the collision of the public sphere of society, the government part of society, and the private sector. And this is going to be the source of a lot of fights and political showdowns. We're going to see the political game of policymaking really kind of, this is where the seeds are sowed for another round of competition. When the government comes in and tries to regulate the private sector and it drives them nuts because it's cutting into profits or cutting into production, then they're going to turn around and say we need to have some new rules that are going to make this a little easier on us. Munn versus Illinois is a very important case that basically sets the limitations for federal regulatory agencies and how much they can do with the private sector. And this is a key case as we started to see the government realize the possibilities of a growing bureaucracy and how much control they could put on the private sector, which may play a role in punishing political enemies in the private sector. So in 1877, the court ruled that the state of Illinois could regulate a Chicago warehouse. And so they basically said, yeah, you're going to have certain kind of standards, certain kind of limitations on workers or whatever. So this was one of the first times that the government regulated the private sector. And once they got that green light, Congress passed its first regulatory agency, which was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is going to start regulating the railroad companies, which means they're going to start setting rules and saying, all right, railroads, you're going to stop doing this, you're going to stop doing that. Your pools, your rebates, and stock watering, and all the little corrupt things that they were doing. So the government makes rules, makes policies, and the ICC is going to try to enforce them. Now, this was the first stab at it by the federal government. It was relatively weak and ineffective, but it was the beginning of the explosion of the federal government and federal regulation all the way up to today, where we see things like the government regulating what kind of toilets and light bulbs we have to get. Next question is, how do they regulate? What kind of things can the bureaucracy do to make sure that people are following the law? Number one, they listen for complaints. An organization like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does it like this. So if they hear about people complaining that their rights are being compromised or that clearly some private entity is not following the law, then they'll listen for those complaints and then they'll step in and do something about it. You may send in inspectors. This is how OSHA does things when they go in and monitor the safety conditions of a private enterprise. And if they find something that's wrong, you can get fined or whatever. They can preempt being able to do business as a private entity by the use of permits. This is how the FCC functions. So if you want to be on the radio or on TV or be in that business, you need to be licensed by the FCC to do that. And anytime you have somebody who is working around your house, like a plumber or something like that, they have to be licensed. It's probably a state or local licensing apparatus, but the same thing at the federal level. If you want to do certain kinds of private activity, you need to be licensed. And then adjudication is another very common method. So this is where you take people to court. If they're not following the rules, then you take them to court and then you get them that way. Now we get to the point where someone's going to suggest that if you have so much regulation and so many of these rules that the bureaucracies are coming up with, then you're gonna strangle the private sector so much that they're not going to be able to produce their goods or hire people or have competitive prices and so on. And so a lot of people argue, mainly conservatives, for deregulation, which is to get rid of lots of government red tape and government restrictions on business and industry and professional activities. And they're going to say that if corporations and businesses, and all the way down to small businesses or whatever, if they have to spend less money becoming compliant with all the regulations, then they can lower their prices because they're going to be able to have that money to make their products more cheaply. They're going to make them more competitive. They can pay their people more, their laborers more. Instead of forking over money to regulators to be in code, then you can actually hire people. And just plainly, it doesn't work. We again come back to the hydraulic theory here of politics, that money's going to get to where it needs to be. And if you're a corporation and you have to follow all these rules, well, it's just going to make you take a different path to the profits that you seek. And then you wind up with unintended consequences, which could be worse than the original problem that you were trying to regulate as the government. Oversight is another major issue with the bureaucracy, because as time goes by, the administrative state of the bureaucracy is getting so much more powerful, but they're unelected and they're a lot of times doing things behind closed doors. We don't really know what's going on as citizens. And so they're making major policies, though, and they have a lot of authority to do that. And it becomes very difficult then with all of these scenarios to really control them or provide any oversight. And remember, when the Constitution was drafted, the fathers didn't have any real concept of a large bureaucracy that needed to be checked by another branch. With that said, we do have a couple of provisions that keep them in line. Number one, the president can regulate the bureaucracy by appointing the right people for the job, issuing executive orders to make sure that the law gets back on track if it's not being implemented properly. Reorganizing is another way. After 9/11, there was a lot of reorganization with Homeland Security offices to make it more effective. Again, the limitation here is that the bureaucracy at any given time, especially the high-ups, are going to be arms of the president. They're his own people. He put them there in most cases. And so you're only going to get so much, so many attempts by the president to crack down on bureaucracies that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. On the other hand, Congress does have a little more power to regulate the bureaucracy. Number one, Congress can issue rewards to the bureaucracies. So if you're an agency or an office or a bureau and you are faithful to the letter of the law that is passed by Congress, then you may get rewarded with a bigger budget. Or if you do a good job and Congress likes you, they can expand your budget. They can also rewrite legislation. So let's say the bureaucracy has hijacked the intent of a law and are kind of using their own regulatory powers to implement the law that they want to instead of what Congress intended. Well, then they can go back and rewrite the legislation, shore up those holes or clear up those gray areas, and pass the law over again so that they couldn't get away with that. Whistleblowers is a term that we hear every now and then in the bureaucracy. And this is where somebody who is in the bureaucracy looks around and notices that things are not going the way they're supposed to be going. All the way from incompetence up to lawlessness. And so the figurative term whistleblower would suggest that they're going to blow their whistle and say, stop the game, something is going on here that shouldn't be going on. It doesn't really play out that way. Usually they're going to keep their mouth shut and then go and let somebody know about what's going on, whether it be the FBI or somebody in Congress. And so then we wind up with this political theater of Congress putting together some kind of oversight committee that's going to allow the whistleblower to testify, give information, and figure out what the heck is going on in this bureaucracy, and try to get it back on track and bring those who are doing the wrongdoing to accountability. And so Congress does work with the bureaucracy a lot on oversight. As we'll see in a moment, they also work together for each other's mutual benefit. And that takes us to the next thing, which is the iron triangle. All right, so iron triangles is a simple picture about how policy is made and maintained mainly behind closed doors. Because what we see out front is Congress debating these bills on C-SPAN, and everyone's giving these big old speeches, and then they pass the bill, and the president has a signing ceremony with a bunch of people around him, and he signs it with 4 different pens so they can all go to museums, and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance with that. In reality, policy making at a higher level is happening behind closed doors, and there are a couple of key entities involved, and those are congressional committees, interest groups, and bureaucratic agencies. Here's why this happens. Why is it those three? It seems like kind of a peculiar set of players that are going to be the most powerful. You got to remember, the president only has so much time to deal with the minute details. Congress only has so much time to deal with minute details, the Congress on the whole, that is. And so they kind of leave it to these smaller sub-governments, is what we would call them, to kind of hash out the details and kind of keep an eye on policy making on any one issue. So when we talk about these iron triangles, they're issue by issue. Every major issue is going to have its triangle of players. So for example, we're talking about Social Security and pensions and entitlements for the elderly. So that would be the pensions for the elderly triangle. The players involved would be, for example, the AARP. That's an interest group that looks out for elderly folks. They're going to work closely with the bureaucracy that deals mostly with these old age pensions, which is the Social Security Administration. And then the Senate committee that deals with health, education, and labor may be involved on this iron triangle. And what they're going to do is make deals with one another. For example, maybe the AARP is going to make promises to the congressional committees and its members by saying, look, if you hook us up with this policy, then you can expect the campaign contributions and the expertise that we carry to keep flowing. The bureaucracy might say, now wait a second, if we're going to implement this law that you want, AARP, then we're going to need a certain amount of budget support from Congress. And then maybe you can give us expertise as well, and we'll implement the law the way that you want. So everybody's expecting some kind of back scratching from the others. And we get to the point where whoever makes the best deal is going to be the one who controls that triangle. And so the AARP then says, we'll give you all kinds of donations to Congress, and we'll provide information. We'll give information to the bureaucracy to help them implement the way we want. And then Congress says, fine, we'll give a huge budget to the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy says, okay, we'll implement the law the way that you say. And presto, you've got an iron triangle that's functional. Here's the thing, though. Usually there's two entities. Usually there's two sides to every political issue, like we've learned already. And there may be two opposing forces that are trying to dominate that issue network. So what about tobacco? This is one of the famous examples. For years and years and years, the tobacco industries dominated the iron triangle pertaining to should we allow tobacco and to whom. Because the tobacco industry would give massive campaign donations to various members of Congress who are on certain committees, and they would say, okay, I'll do whatever you want as long as you keep these donations flowing. And then they told the bureaucracy, make sure whatever, Health and Human Services or whatever, let's tone down the tobacco will kill you rhetoric because these guys are giving us some big time money and we'll give you a bigger budget. Meanwhile, on the outside looking in several years ago were the anti-tobacco folks, interest groups that would be devoted to things like getting tobacco machines away from schools, or disallowing magazines to put tobacco advertisements on the covers of their magazines. And slowly but surely, the anti-tobacco folks were able to kind of cram their way into that triangle and offer more campaign donations than the tobacco companies could, and make better deals with the bureaucracy, and to the point where the members of Congress and the bureaucracy realized they had a better deal with the anti-tobacco people. More money would flow and more power would be in their hands. And so, over the course of the last generation, we've seen basically the destruction of the tobacco industry. They're on life support at this point. And the anti-tobacco people are firmly in control of that iron triangle. And there's lots of others that we could list, where you've got two diametrically opposed forces trying to gain that third seat, that interest group seat on the Iron Triangle. Especially in talking about religious groups versus civil rights groups, or environmental groups versus energy groups, and so on and so forth. But you also have to remember that there are multiple people trying to get on the seats of the other legs of the Iron Triangles too. Remember, you got Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Some of them will want to make a deal with one interest group. Others will want to make a deal with another interest group, and it just matters as to who's in control of Congress at that point. It also matters who's president at that time. The president gets to appoint all the key people in the bureaucracy, and they can clean house. A new president can go in there and clean house and do this and do that, and you may wind up with a totally new situation on the bureaucracies who are in any given Iron Triangle at any given time. So it is political theater at its best. Unfortunately, we don't get to see very much of it, because these are the kinds of things that are happening in closed-door meetings and smoke-filled rooms. One more thing to mention is that some people believe that the Iron Triangle concept is an antiquated notion, that it's not that simple anymore. And in reality now we have these issue networks, which would be the same players as you have in the Iron Triangles, but a lot more additional players. Maybe the lawyers are in on this. Maybe education is in on this. Civil rights groups may be in on this. Small business or whatever. There's lots of other players that have a say about how policy is made, other than just Congress, the bureaucracy, and the interest groups. And so if we're being honest with ourselves, these things are a little more complicated than just a simple little diagram triangle. So issue networks are the same thing as Iron Triangles, just a little more complicated, a few more players involved.